This talk about carbon fibre, I said, well, you've got a postage stamp. But fortunately, I'd spoken to Bruce beforehand, and Bruce, being a lifetime professional boat builder who's spent a lot of time working in composites and things, at least we've got a professional backup. It's not just my amateur thing. But so then what we're really talking about, because we're wooden boat people, is what you can do with bits of carbon and other composites to complement our wooden boat building, particularly making fittings and little bits and pieces that we might otherwise have to use expensive bronze or whatever. So that's, I think, really what we're going to talk about. That's what you
well,
agree?
that's what I brought this rudder along for.
Yeah.
That's off my Jubilee.
Right.
And I decided to make a new rudder. I'll just go and grab it.
I'll get it.
Because it's a fairly competitive class. And I was looking for every edge I could get out.
And you realise we've got
Very modern design too.
the National President, our Secretary, check on the rules about putting carbon into a Jubilee rudder.
Yeah.
What used to piss me off
That'd be
was
the rule
the
written
bronze
in 1935.
gudgeons were bolted on the sides. It didn't fare in. This bolt head sticking out everywhere. So I thought, oh, I'll put my thinking cap on. So I made up a carbon fibre rudder gudgeon, and the top one here is the same. In my box of bits at home, I had a bronze bolt that was just the right size to fit into the gudgeon. So I made these. Now, first of all, scalloped this out slightly and measured the width I want, and then I went back and cut a piece of timber the right width that I was looking for and rounded the top of it off. Then I stuck some tape on it so I could stick a piece of carbon. Now, we've got all sorts of samples here, but
That you got some big stuff in.
yeah,
That's a bit of unique.
yeah, there'll be probably one or two layers of that in it, and we can show you, we can hand that around. And also, this is just the normal plain wheat carbon, and there'll be one or two layers of that in it. And then to build up the bulk, I'll just grab a bit of rotary. Well, there's two, so I'll put it
Play a tune.
Yeah.
You gonna play a tune?
Later. Let's see, I build up the thickness with this sort of stuff. But we start off with carbon, quite a few layers of this. There's probably about 4 odd layers in that.
How heavy is that?
Well, this is the actual one I use, which is a lighter one. I'll hand it around. The only reason I use the lighter one is because it's very cheap to buy. And there's a few layers of that, and then there's another layer of carbon, probably a couple of layers either side. So there's two layers inside, built up with this, and then another 2 layers. And just the design of it, it's the way and then it's glued onto the actual blade, and then the bottom one especially is glassed over again. And I used a double bias cloth on that, which is some of this cloth here, which is like gluing little steel bars everywhere. It's a fabulous cloth. And then fed it into the rudder, and then the cavity that was in these here, where these holes are, have been filled up with glue. And then I came back and drilled the right size hole through it. This one's a bolt. I turned it up, poured glue inside it, let it go off, and put this in the right place. And there's a set of rudder gudgeons. Probably cost about $20, $25 to make. Quite simple to do.
And really light.
Very light and very strong.
What would the original have been? It would be quite heavy.
Well, I just about broke, I couldn't pick it up with one hand, put it that way. This is a cedar cord, and if you want to have a look at it, there's a bit of anti-foul going off the bottom of it. You can see the core inside.
Yeah.
The main thing I was looking at was trying to get quite a nice shape to it, because the other rudder I had on Isabel was like a barn door, and I wanted to give Tony a bit of a hurry up. So we built this, and it's a lot lighter. It actually floats
Wow.
on the boat. so therefore there's virtually no weight on it. Yeah, and that's
Is
how I,
that pencil cedar?
so,
Is that pencil cedar?
oh, it's just some old red cedar that I got given to me ages ago and I just use it up.
Cedar or something.
It's Queensland red.
Oh, right.
Yeah. It's not very good cedar, but it's just something I had. Yeah, and quite simple to do, and it's quite a lightweight. And you know, the other one was traditionally made with brass gudgeons on, and believe me, it weighs a ton. And it's when you put leaning over the back of the gut trying to put it on, you're just about going with it. Yeah.
So how close is the bottom gudgeon to the bottom of the transom on the boat?
Yes, it's just about at the bottom of the keel.
Right at the
It's just about down about here somewhere.
There's not a lot of rudder below it.
And there's a little bit of it.
Yes.
There's a little bit of it that's close to it.
Sorry, that's 6 inches from it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I didn't want to modify the shape of it because I thought, I don't know, this is the same profile as the original rudder. Otherwise, if I got
The
carried away.
measuring tape's coming out afterwards just to make sure.
I don't want to cheat,
He's
but
taking notes.
I do like to, well, beat my opposition.
You put a wing on the bottom?
Yeah, well, I'll just put this in. So we've got a bit of overspray on it, but, and this is actually, it's not for my boat, but it's a bracket to hold the alternator on my Austin 7. Now, I'm not a welder, I'm not a metal fabricator, and as you see, I'll explain a little bit more about my Austin, which is boat related. I'll pass this around, you can feel how light and strong. That's exactly the same. Carbon, some of this woven cloth in the centre, and then carbon again. And it was probably done in 2 hits. I don't like to do too many laminates at once because it creates a lot of heat, which weakens the resin. And then another little thing I do is, instead of vacuum bagging, I have...
Could you start with very thin, but good quality plywood, which would make it easier to...
Yeah, I've done that.
And then
There's another
carbon
bracket.
straight on that.
Yeah, there's another bracket that I made up that I want to get a little bit of bulk in it, so I put some plywood in the middle of it to the glass, and that's worked out really well. But so, well, what I do, instead of vacuum bagging, because that costs money, I make up one of these, 2 of them, and I clamp them either side and press not too hard, just enough to hold the clamps in place, and it squeezes out the excess resin and takes any air bubbles and stuff, etc. out of it. Because, well, we'll go back to the America's Cup boat that's split in half. I happen to know a little bit of history about that, but there was a bit of air caught in the laminate. And the day before they heard a couple of pings go off with it. And it happens with carbon fibre masts. Air bubble in the mast, sailing along one day and you hear a ding. That's one of the strands let go. We've probably got a few hours later and the whole lot's going to come down. So it's air trapped in the laminates, especially with carbon, weakens it.
The blackjack people know that.
Yeah, well, that's what
Especially when you said it just fell over the side.
yeah.
So
That's what happens.
Just fell over the side.
Do you use a bit of a release agent for your clamping?
Sometimes
But mostly just tape.
That's all
there's
it's
tape.
got.
I've got packaging tape and I've got sellotape.
Yep, okay.
But
Yeah,
sometimes I throw a bit of release agent on.
Yeah.
But
So if you
and
just
then,
wet it out, like squeegee and then like peel ply it,
yeah,
so you're obviously not going to get as much resin out.
yeah.
Obviously you've added a bit of weight, but is there a strength difference between that and properly, getting it by the vacuum bag or properly squeezed out?
It's exactly the same as vacuum bagging.
No, but if you don't vacuum bag
Yeah.
or squeeze it out, you just sort of...
I know what happens. You get a
squeeze
build
it.
up of resin.
You get too much
You
resin.
get too much resin, and it's the cloth that's giving you the strength.
So it is actually weaker
Yeah.
if you leave too much resin.
Yeah, it gets a bit more brittle if you leave too much resin behind. Now, right, that brings me on to the next bit of carbon fibre, the Nomex there.
What do you want to know?
Yeah, these are 2 panels out of an 18-foot skip that we used to build back in the 90s. They're carbon fibre and known as honeycomb floors. They would have done the vacuum bags and all that, but we had a machine to wet out the fabric. So because we were looking for weight, and we're looking for every gram of weight we can save in the boat. And once you start at the beginning, and by the time you get to the end of the boat, you're saving grams here, you end up with kilos. But we've also got to maintain the strength. But the ideal wet-out ratio was about 60%. And we had a machine, like it was just a simple set of rollers, like Mum's old washing machine. We had much the same as that. The cloth went into the trough of resin, and we squeezed a bit of it out, and it came out the other side. We'd snip a bit off, weigh it until we were happy with about 60% resin ratio in it, and then we'd continue on and lay it all down one hit.
So is there no minimum weight for an 18-foot skip?
No.
80 feet?
If you build them too light, they break, and if you build them too heavy, they won't win races. So we've got to build them just at the point of breaking. And there's a lot of trial and error in it. But anyway, I'll hand these around because try and bend, break, whatever you like. But it's quite interesting.
Rob, they're all exclusively.
That lightweight weave, that's sort of...
Well,
No,
basically these two are the same. One's just a heavy
they're
weave,
not
one's
separate,
light.
they're not separate.
Okay.
It's woven
No.
rovings, they're sort of,
They're woven rovings.
they're not like a cloth there.
Do you know what Nomex actually is?
It's Kevlar, honeycomb Kevlar.
Kevlar, right.
That's why it's so damn expensive to buy. I mean, if you wanted to build a boat out of that, you better have a pretty big checkbook. I mean, extremely big one.
Maury, you...
Oh, it'll
Do you
flex
have a
slightly.
question?
Rob, I was curious, the resin that you use to,
Well, it's all epoxy resins.
do you have any special tricks for the epoxy?
There are some resins better than others, but if you stick to the normal West System resin, or the resin that Craig sells, I gave it a few taps with a hammer so it didn't leave any air bubbles behind. But, you know, and that's now I don't know how much bronze gudgeons would have cost, but I've got a nice fair gudgeon.
How much would they weigh?
Yeah.
Well, that's half the weight of a normal rubber, put it that way.
Is this is uni?
Yeah.
So they're just held in place by
Well, just
a little cross stitch of some
Yeah,
sort.
that one probably shows you, you can see it for that. That's interesting, isn't it? Just a little stitch.
So it would be really good for reinforcing
Hey,
things.
Bruce, that angle bracket that's been passed around, you can grind that, no dramas.
probably be ground up, and I've cut it with a
Yeah, Kevlar you can't grind.
no, not Kevlar. Even though I'd like to use Kevlar, but that's got to get trimmed up and holes drilled through it for the hold the alternator on, and it's got to be mounted on the head of the car.
And why can't you cut the Kevlar one?
Well, but it goes furry.
Right.
It goes very furry wherever you cut it. You don't
Okay.
get a nice, whereas this stuff, you get a nice clean cut. I use like a metal cutting blade, one of those narrow ones. In fact, I was cutting the deck off a Harland the other day. I put two blades together so I can keep scattering them all the time. And they work fantastic.
So can I just ask, can you use this on boat decks if you've got washing a boat deck versus the glass, I'm not great at this stuff, but can you use this for the deck covering as well?
Yes, well, I'll give you an example. I've got a trailer sailor and it's got a timber blade with glass around it, and it must have had a bit of rock in it at one stage. And some idiot got some steel nails and laid across it and then put a big blob of chopped strand on it. And with polyester resin on a painted surface. That didn't stick. So I just split it all off and I ground out that affected area, and then I used some thinned out epoxy resin and coated and let it soak in, because if there's any remains of rock that isolates the pores. And then I basically filled it up with a mixture of half Cabicel and half Q cells, because I was looking for a bit of strength. And you can do that with this stuff. You don't have to use all one or the other. You can mix the two together, or whilst
So
the
just to explain that, Q cells are microscopic spheres,
yeah.
like micro-balloons, which were the bakelite ones.
Very light.
Yeah, and so it weighs nothing, they're almost like a gas when you pick it up. Whereas the cavasil is, they call it colloidal silica. It's silica exploded electrically, so it's like tiny little snowflakes. So they hang together, you know, make a really strong thing. Whereas
Is this a fabric or a resinous?
no, we're talking about the filler.
It's just powder.
You put it into the resin.
Core?
Grinder with a soft pad on it, and it's a rubber pad that you can buy them at Bunnings, and then you've got the grinding discs, and I've got about 40 grit discs I think, and I'll grind into it until I get some clean timber. Then,
Okay, so it's
This is
rock
this is
tree,
a plywood.
just get rid of the wash.
if it's Robert right through, you cut it out on another
This
piece,
is a plywood deck you're talking about, isn't
or
it?
anything.
So we should just chip the fiberglass off it.
So,
We could just chip the current fiberglass off it.
well, you can grind it off with these grinders.
Oh, okay.
Cut it off, it's a big area.
You just grind it off. It blows dust everywhere.
It's polyester, it'll probably just peel off.
Yeah, well, if it's polyester, you're in a bit of trouble. And it seems to be quite common in Brisbane is to use polyester resin for skinning old boats. And it doesn't stick. It might stick for a year or two. But a friend of mine's got one at the moment. It's up on the Harland, the water's pouring out everywhere. And it was done about 5 years ago. And you can pick the edge of it and basically just pull it off the boat. But it was an epoxy.
And that was polyester, but it was a really big score.
Yeah. And the things that's happened to this boat where the polyester's lifted off the hull, the worm's gone in behind it, and away it's gone. Now, I've got another boat at home that's possibly about 90 years old, and it's sheathed with that. And it was done 10 years ago, and it's still as good as the day it was done. And that was not,
The bigger boat you're talking about, so that you say yours
Yeah.
is not a strip plank boat, is it a
yeah,
strip
strip
plank?
back cedar.
Right, okay.
The cedar would be, from memory, probably about 1 inch and 1/8 thick, something like that, with a heavier layer of cloth, like this on either side. The Fantasia, she's a big boat, but she goes like clappers. I held the record in it for a while, I hit 27 knots in it. It was going into Cabbage Creek in the Surf the City race one day, and it took them a couple of years to get beat back by record. But, you know, for a 50-foot cat doing that, and there's some strain on that thing.
So with the deck, you just put line and then something like
Well, it'd be better if we had a look at it.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Yeah, but
Just a generalisation.
But when you're making up a thickness like that, you were saying you can use your lightweight filler.
well, your
as well
lightweight
as-
filler with Q cells.
Yeah,
Now, I'll call it a bomb. We'll make up a bomb.
yeah.
And you can fill some pretty big holes and crevices and that with them. And then it doesn't hurt to put a glass cloth over it. But some people do Dynal on their decks. Now, Dynal, when it was first invented, was just to put a hard layer on the deck. It doesn't really contribute any strength. Whereas if you start using surfboard mat or this sort of mat, you are actually putting some strength into it. And especially where you've got joins in your plywood or timber. This, later on I'll show you a boat I've done that had splits all the way down the keel, the chine, and it was just it's 45 years old, over the years it's just moved. But it's now glassed and it's all held itself together.